Um, Welcome back. We are in part two of Henry David Thoreau Walden, Living Life on the Edge. Okay, so I guess I forgot that this book was openly a bit hostile to Christianity. Did not intend that to be the first book, but yeah, I'll just read like a few of the key sections from last time as a reminder, and then we can go on to the next chapter. I did read ahead this time just to make sure I am more familiar with what we're actually talking about today, and just hopefully this will go a little bit smoother than it did yesterday. So here's some of the key quotes from yesterday. I went into the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I come to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear, nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if proved to be mean, then why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world, or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, to be able to give it a true account of my next excursion. For most men, it appears to me, are in quite a strange uncertainty about it, whether it is of the devil or of God, and have somewhat hastily concluded that it is the chief end of man here to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. So he's clearly against that end of enjoying God forever, and is very much in favor of like this um, lifestyle apart from that, and trying to think things through and live life for yourself. So that's kind of like the real thesis of this book and what he's working towards and what he's getting after. But if we think that this section is hostile, I think he's going to be much more clear in the next section on what he is going to explain. He does talk about Homer and the Iliad, which is exciting. Apparently, Chris Nolan is making a movie about that for this summer, so it should be exciting to watch. I haven't read the Iliad or the Odyssey in quite some time. They're quite lengthy and very long poems, and interesting. I think Homer's Iliad was passed down through the generations just by like memorization for like hundreds of years, and I I'm pretty sure if I'm remembering that correctly. And so it's kind of cool that we even have these stories today, but also like the fact that they're very lengthy and such poetic pieces of work. It's pretty cool to read. Um, yeah. Okay. Well, this is and I do recall that this is a bit of a shorter chapter, so maybe this might be a little bit of a shorter episode, and we can keep it going like that. Okay, here we go. With a little more deliberation in the choice of their pursuits, all men would perhaps become essentially students and observers, for certainly their nature and destiny are interesting to all alike. In accumulating property for ourselves or our posterity, in founding a family or a state, or acquiring fame even, we are mortal. But in dealing with truth, we are immortal. We need fear no charge. Oh, sorry. We need fear no change nor accident. The oldest Egyptian or Hindu philosopher raised a corner of the veil from the statue of the divinity, and still the trembling robes remained raised, and I gaze upon as fresh as glory as he did, since it was I in him that was then so bold, and it is he in me that now reviews the vision. No dust has settled on that robe. No time has elapsed since the divinity was revealed. That time which we really improve or which is improvable is neither past, present, nor future. This is actually an interesting idea that was kind of explored by Kierkegaard. Removing the illusion of time. Kierkegaard was a Christian existential thinker. He's kind of like the founder of existentialism, but he very much founded existentialism towards God. And so, but he talked about these things about like how we should think about, say, Jesus, like because he was a Christian, in terms of not that he is this old historic figure, but that he, as if he was here today, and to remove that illusion of time. And so he's clearly, I don't know if, I assume Kierkegaard was before Thoreau, and clearly Thoreau is well versed in the classics. He's well read in Plato. and has clearly gone through the Iliad and Odyssey, and has a lot of these texts, and even talks about that here as well, about talking with a Canadian lumberjack about his experiences with the classics, which a lawyer, I believe he did go through law school, would have experience with, and how he like just is annoyed that like he talks about this as well, how no one really he talked about this in the last chapter about how like there's only 1 in 100 million who actually understand what's going on, and only one, and like how there's like so few people who he feels like he can talk to about these things. Very interesting. Okay. My residence was a more favorable, not only to thought, but to serious mm-mm. My residence was more favorable, not only to thought, but to serious reading than a university. And though I was beyond the range of the ordinary circulating library, I had more than ever come within the influence of those books which circulate round the world. Those sentences were first written on bark, and are now merely copied from time to time onto linen paper. Says the poet Merkavin the Mast, being seated to run through the region of the spiritual world, I have had this advantage to books, to be intoxicated by a single glass of wine. I have experienced this pleasure when I have drank from the liquor of exotic doctrines. I kept Homer's Iliad on my table through the summer, though I looked at its page only now and then. Incessant labor with my hands. At first, for I had my house to finish and my beans to hoe at the same time, made much more made more study impossible. Yet I sustain myself by the prospect of such reading in future. I read 1 or 2 shallow books of travel in my intervals of my work, till that employment made me ashamed of myself, and I ask where it was then that I lived. The student may read Homer or another that looks like an ancient Greek name, Ulysses, in the Greek without danger of dispensation or luxuriousness, for it implies that he in some measure emulate their heroes and consecrate morning hours to their pages. The heroic books, even if printed in the character of our mother's tongue, will always be in the language dead to degenerate times, and we must laboriously seek the meaning of each word and line, conjecturing a larger sense than common use permits, out of what wisdom and valor and generosity we have. The modern cheap and fertile press, with all its translations, has done little to bring us near to the heroic writers of antiquity. They seem as solitary, and the letter in which they are printed as rare and curious as ever. It is worth the expense of youthful days and costly hours if you learn only some words of an ancient language, which are raised out of the trivialness of the street to be perpetual suggestions and provocations. It is not in vain that the farmer remembers and repeats the few Latin words which he has heard. Men sometimes speak as if the study of classics would at length make way for the modern and practical studies, but the adventurous student will always study the classics in whatever language they may be written and however ancient they may be. For what are the classics but the noblest record of thought, noblest recorded thoughts of man? They are the only oracles which are not decayed, and there are such answers to the most modern inquiry in them as Delphi and Donda never gave. So Delphi is the Oracle of Delphi had like a special place in Hellenistic society, ancient Greek society. They kind of like stood to give proclamations on private matters and also for the state. Kind of like, will we win this war? Let's go ask the gods. But the Oracle of Delphi is also notably famous because the Oracle said that Socrates was the wisest of them all, and then Socrates responds by basically saying, "I am the wisest because I know that I know nothing." And so that's where that famous line comes from, the Oracle of Delphi and Socrates, which is basically the only reason why we care about um, the Oracle of Delphi from this context, I guess. But I'm not really sure what he's meaning to when he says Donda never gave. Again, like this is the first time, if you've never gone through these before, like this This is just like an introductory cursory reading, like to understand like what's going on, what he stands for, and to kind of see the text originally for yourself. And so the goal is just to kind of see how other people think, and that's kind of what we do in philosophy. Here we go. We might as well admit to study nature because she is old. To read well, that is, to read true books in a true spirit, is a noble exercise, and one that will task the reader more than any exercise which the customs of the day esteem. It requires a training such as athletes underwent, the study intention almost of the whole life to this object, whole life to this object. Books must be read as deliberately and reservedly as they were written. It is not enough to be able to speak the language of the nation by which they are written, for there is a memorable interval between the spoken and the written language, the language heard and the language read. The one is commonly transitory, the sound, a tongue, a dialect, merely almost brutish, and we learn it unconsciously, and the brutes of like the brutes of our mothers. Interesting. The other is the maturity and experience of that. If that is our mother tongue, this is our father tongue, a reserved and select expression, too significant to be heard by the ear, which we must be born again in order to speak. The crowds of men who merely spoke the Greek and Latin tongues in the Middle Ages were not entitled by the by the accident of birth to read the works of genius written in those languages. For these were not written in that Greek or Latin which they knew, but in the select language of literature, that had not learned the nobler dialects of Greek and Rome, but the very materials on which they were written were waste paper to them. They were prized instead of cheap contemporary literature, but when the several nations of Europe had acquired distinct through rude written languages of their own, sufficient for the purposes of their rising literatures, then learning revived, and scholars were enabled to discern from that remoteness the treasures of antiquity, what the Roman and Grecian multitude could not hear. After the lapse of ages, a few scholars read, and a few scholars only were still reading it. Yeah, notably, like Plato and all these classics disappeared for 1,000 years, hence like the Western Dark Ages. And so that was like what, after the fire of Alexandria of what, 400 or 20 AD? And so like Walden, taking place in the middle of the 1800s here, like the Renaissance happened, what was that, 1600s? 1700s? Must have been 1600s. That's when Martin Luther, was he 16 or 1516? I always get them confused, but somewhere around there. So like he's a couple hundred, so Thoreau is a couple hundred years after these have been discovered, but it still hasn't made their way out to the masses. Notably, like the printing press was invented in like the 1400s, so like technology takes time to spread. This is not just like some widespread internet phenomenon where like new technology is created and then is just immediately widely dispersed and available to everyone. This takes time to be developed, and like quite notably, like hundreds of years, and we're for people to be able to get access to this kind of information, which is kind of what he's alluding to in this section. However much we may admire the order's occasional bursts of eloquence, the noblest written words are commonly as far behind or above the fleeting spoken word as the firmament, and with its stars is behind the clouds. There are the stars, and they who may read them. The astronomers forever comment on and observe them. They are not exhalt, exhal, exhal, exhalation, exhalations. Goodness, like our daily colloquies or vaporous breath. What is called eloquence in the forum is commonly found to be rhetoric in the study. The order yields to the inspiration of the transient occasion and speaks to the mob before him, to those who can hear him, but the writer, whose more equable life is his occasion, and who would be distracted by the event and the crowd which inspire the order, speaks to the intellect and heart of mankind, to all in any age who can understand him. No wonder that Alexander carried the Iliad with him on his expeditions in a precious casket. A written word is the choicest of relics. It is something at once more intimate with us and more universal than any other work of art. It is the work of art nearest to life itself. It may be translated into every language and not only be read, but actually breathed from all human lips, not be represented on canvas or in marble only, but be carved out of the breath of life itself. The symbol of ancient man's thoughts become a modern man's speech. 2,000 summers have imparted the monuments of Greek literature as to her marbles, only a mature, golden, and autumnal tint, for they have carried their own serene and celestial atmosphere into all lands to protect them against the corrosion of time. Books are the treasured wealth of the world, and the fit inheritance of generations and nations. Books, the oldest and the best, stand naturally and rightfully on the shelves of every cottage, and have no cause in their own to plead, but while they enlighten and sustain the reader, his common sense will not refuse them. Their authors are a natural and irresistible aristocracy in every society, and more than kings or emperors exert an influence on mankind. When the illiterate and perhaps scornful trader has earned by enterprise and industry his coveted leisure and independence, and is admitted to the circles of wealth and fashion, he turns inevitably at last to those still higher and yet inaccessible circles of intellect and genius, and is sensible only of the imperfection of his culture and the vanity and insufficiency of all his riches, and further proves his good sense by the pains which he takes to secure for his children that intellectual culture whose want he so keenly feels. And thus it is that he becomes the founder of a family. Those who have not learned to read the ancient classics in a language in which they were written must have a very imperfect knowledge of the history of the human race, for it is remarkable that no transcript of them has ever been made into any modern tongue, unless our civilization itself may be regarded as such a transcript. Homer has not yet been published in English, nor Alesius, nor Virgil even. Works as refined, as solidly done, and as beautiful almost as the morning itself. For later writers, say what they will of their genius, have rarely, if ever, equaled the elaborate beauty and finish and the lifelong and heroic literary labors of the ancients. Though they only talk of forgetting them who never they only talk of forgetting them who never knew them. It will soon be enough to forget them when we have the learning and the genius which will enable us to attend to and appreciate them. That age will be rich indeed when those relics which we call classics, and the older still, the more than classics, but even less than scriptures of the nations, still have further accumulated when the Vatican shall be filled with Vedas and Z- hmm, Vedas and Zendavestas, and Bibles with Homers and Dantes and Shakespeare's, and all the centuries to come shall have successfully deposited their trophies in the forum of the world. By such a pile we may hope to scale heaven at last. The works of such great poets have never yet been read by mankind, for only great poets can read them. They have only been read as the multitude read the stars, as most astrology, not astronomy. At most, astrologically, not astronomically. Astrologically, not astronomically. I don't know what he means by that. Most men have learned to read to serve a paltry convenience. Sorry, moving around a lot. As they have learned to cipher in order to keep accounts and not be cheated in trade. But of reading as a noble intellectual exercise, they know little or nothing. Yet this only is reading, a high scene, not that which lulls as is a luxury and suffers the nobler faculties to sleep the while, what we have to stand on tiptoe to read and devote our most alert and wakeful hours to. I think I have learned our letters we should read the best that is in literature and not be forever repeating A-B abs, our A-B abs. The words of one syllable in the fourth or fifth classes sitting on the lowest and foremost forms of all life. Most men are satisfied if they read or hear read, and perchance have been convicted by the wisdom of one good book, the Bible, and for the rest of their lives vegetate and dissipate their faculties in what is called easy reading. There is a work in several volumes in our circulating library entitled Little Reading, which I thought referred to a town of that name, which I had not been to. There are those who, like cormorants or ostriches, can digest all sorts of things, even after the fullest dinner of meats and vegetables, for they suffer nothing to be wasted. If others are the machines to provide this provider, they are the machines to read it. They read the 9,000 tale of Zebulon and Sephora, and how they loved as none had ever loved before, and neither did the course of their true love run smooth. At any rate, how did it run and stumble, and get up again and go on? How some poor unfortunate got up to a steeple, who had better never have gone up as far as the belfry, and then, having needlessly got him up there, the happy novelist rings the bell for all the world to come together and hear. Oh dear, how did how did how he did get down again. For my part, I think that they had better metamorphose metamorphose all such aspiring heroes of universal noveldom into man's weathercocks as they used to put heroes among the constellations, and let them swing round there until they are rusty, and not come down at all to bother honest men with their pranks. The next time the novelist rings the bell, I will not stir through the meeting house, burn down the skip of the tiptoe hop, the romance of the Middle Ages, by the celebrated author of Tittle Tan, to appear in monthly parts, a great rush, don't all come together. All this they read with the saucier eyes, and erect with primitive curiosity, and with unweariedly gizzard, all with unwearied gizzard, Gizzard, whose, oh my goodness, this old English is annoying, whose congregations even yet need no sharpening, just as some little 4-year-old bencher his 2-cent gilt-covered edition of Cinderella without any improvement that I can see in the pronunciation or accent or emphasis, or any more skill or in extracting or inserting the moral. The result is dullness of sight, a stagnation in the vital circulations, and a general declinium and sloughing off of all intellectual facilities. This sort of gingerbread is baked daily and more sedulously than pure wheat or rye and Indian in almost every oven, and finds a surer market. The best books are not read, even by those who are called good readers. What does our Concord culture amount to? There is in this town, with a very few exceptions, no taste for the best or very good books, even in English literature, whose words all can read and spell. Even the college-bred and so-called liberally educated men here and elsewhere have really little or no acquaintance with the English classics, and for the recorded wisdom of mankind, the ancient classics and Bibles, which are accessible to all who will know of them. There are the feeblest efforts anywhere made to become acquainted with them. I know a woodchopper of middle age who takes a French paper, not for news, as he says, for he is above that, but to keep himself in practice. He being a Canadian by birth, and when I ask him what he considers the best thing he can do in this world, he says, beside this, to keep up and add to his English, this is about as much as a college-bred generally do or aspire to do. They take an English paper for the purpose, one who can just come from reading perhaps one of the best English books will find how many with whom he can converse about it. We'll find how many with whom he can converse about it. Or suppose he comes from reading a Greek or Latin classic in the original, whose phrases are familiar even to the so-called illiterate. He will find nobody at all to speak to, but must keep silent about it. Indeed, there is hardly the professor in our colleges who, if he has mastered the difficulties of the language, has proportionately mastered the difficulties of the wit and poetry of the Greek poet, and has any sympathy to impart to the alert and heroic reader. As for the sacred scriptures or Bibles of mankind, who in this town can tell me even their titles? Most men do not even know that any nation but the Hebrews have had a scripture. Any man, will go considerably out of his way to pick up a silver dollar. But here are golden words, which the wisest men of antiquity have uttered, and whose worth the wise of every succeeding age have assured us of, and yet we learn to read only as far as easy reading. The primers and classic books, and when we leave school, the little reading and story books, which are for boys and beginners, and our reading and conversation and thinking are all at a very low level. Worthy only of pygmies and manikins. Manikins? Okay, well, I don't know. I aspire to be acquainted with the wiser men than this our Concord soil has produced, whose names are hardly known here. Or shall I hear the name of Plato and never read his book, as if Plato were my townsman and I never saw him, my next neighbor, and I never heard him speak or attended to the wisdom of his words? But how actually is it? His dialogues, which contain what was immortal in him, lie in the next shelf, and yet I never read them? We are underbred and low-lived and illiterate. And in this respect, I confess I do not make a very broad distinction between the illiterateness of my townsman, who cannot read at all, and the illiterateness of him who has learned to read only what is for children and of feeble intellect. We should be as good as the worthies of antiquity, but partly by first knowing how good they were. We are in a race of hitmen, and soar but little higher in our intellectual flights than the columns of the daily paper. It is not all books. I've underlined this entire next paragraph and another paragraph on the next page. So straighten up. It is not all books that are as dull as our readers. They're all probably words addressed to our condition exactly, which, if we could really hear and understand, would be more sultry than the morning or the spring to our lives, and possibly put a new aspect on the face of things for us. How many a man has dated a new era in this life from the reading of a how many a man has dated a new era in his life from the reading of a book? The book exists for us perchance, which will explain our miracles and reveal new ones. The at present unutterable things we may find somewhere uttered. The same questions that disturb and puzzle and confound us have in their turn occurred to all the wise men. Not one has been omitted, and each has answered them according to his ability by his words and his life. Moreover, with wisdom we shall learn liberality. The solitary man hired on a farm in the outskirts of Concord, who has had a second birth and peculiar religious experience, and is driven, as he believes, into silent gravity and exclusiveness by his faith, may think it not true. But Zocasters thousands of years ago traveled the same road and had the same experience. But he, being wise, knew it to be universal and treated his neighbors accordingly, and is even said to have invented and established worship among men. Let him humbly commune with Zocaster then, through the liberalizing influence of all the worthies with Jesus Christ himself, and let our church go by the board. I did a little bit of research into who the Zocaster was. 6th century BCE, so notably Plato was about 400 years BCE. So the 600 years is a couple hundred years before him. He was considered like an early prophet to the Abrahamic faiths, like including Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and a prominent religious leader in Iran, and is said to be the world's oldest monotheistic religion. So a religion that serves only one god instead of a multitude of gods, like the Greeks would have traditionally believed. It did fall out of favor and no longer exists, but Iran is where mostly that happened. I'm not really sure why he is so aware of who Zoroaster. But anyways, I'm not really sure the significance of him, but that's kind of who he is, and um, makes that point there. Okay, we boast that. Oh yeah, so halfway through, middle of this is also underlined. This next page. We boast that we belong to the 19th century and we are making the most rapid strides of any nation, but consider how little this village does for its own culture. I do not wish to flatter my townsmen, nor to be flattened by them, for that will not advance either of us. We need to be provoked, goaded like oxen, as we are into a trot. We have a comparatively decent system of common schools, schools for infants only, but expecting the half-starved lyceum in the winter and latterly and puny beginning of a library suggested by the state, no school for ourselves. Notably, the public education system wasn't really expanded until the early 1900s, I think like 1906, 1910, 1916. Like those dates are standing out to me as like major turning points in when like one-room schoolhouses were like built, and at least in Canada. And this was done. Some of that work in the States was also done in the late 1800s as well. I think most of that kind of stuff was done after 1862, which is when Thoreau died. Really, those 40 years afterwards and the first like 20 years of the 20th century are really when you see the public education system come together in North America. And so here, when he's talking about how they don't have an education system, it's true. Like, it's interesting. They had a school, like what it seems like a daycare, but no actual school. Okay. We spend more on almost any article of bodily ailment or ailment than on our mental ailment. It is time that we had uncommon schools, that we did not leave off our education when we begin to be men and women. It is time that villages were universities, and their elder inhabitants the fellows of the universities, with leisure, if they are indeed so well off to pursue liberal studies the rest of their lives. Shall the world be confined to one Paris or one Oxford forever? Cannot students be boarded here and get liberal education under the skies of Concord? Can we not hire some Abelard to lecture to us? Alas, what the foddering the cattle and tending the store we kept from the school too long, and our education is sadly neglected. In this country, the village should be in some respects take place of the nobleman of Europe. It should be the patron of the fine arts. It is rich enough. It only wants the magnanimity and refinement. It can spend money enough on such things as farmers and traders value, but it is thought utopian to propose spending money for such things which more intelligent men know to be of far more worth. This town has spent $17,000 on a townhouse. Think fortune or politics, but it will probably not spend so much on living wit. The true meat to put into that shell in 100 years. The $125 annually subscribed for a lyceum in the winter is better spent than any other equal sum raised in the town. If we live in the 19th century, why should we not enjoy the advantages which the 19th century offers? Why should our life be in any respect provincial? We will read newspapers. Why not skip the gossip of the Boston and take the best newspaper in the world at once? Not be sucking the pap of neutral family papers or browsing olive branches here in New England. Let the reports of all the learned societies come to us, and we will see if they know anything. Why should we leave it to Harper and Brothers and Redding and Co. to select? Our reading. The noble man of cultivated tastes surrounds himself with whatever conduces to his culture, genius, learning, wit, books, painting, statuary, music, philosophical instruments, and the like. So let the village do, not stop short of a pedagogue, a person, a sexton, a parish library, and 3 selectmen, because our pilgrim forefathers got thorough a cold winter once on a bleak rock with these. To act collectively is according to the spirit of our institutions, and I am confident that, as our circumstances are more flourishing, our means are greater than the noblemen's. New England can hire all the wise men in the world to come and teach her, the, the board them round the while, and not be provincial at all. This is the uncommon school we want. Instead of noblemen, let us have noble villages of men. And it is necessary. Omit one bridge over the river, go round a little there, and throw one arc at least over the dark, excuse me, and throw one arch at least over the darker gulf of ignorance which surrounds us. That is the end of that chapter. One other thing I forgot to mention about Soulcaster is that with just doing like a Wikipedia search on him, it seems that he's very much like also kind of like, I think this is also why Thoreau likes him and is mentioning him here, is that Soulcaster seems to be connected to nature and kind of like this Heideggerian sense. So like Martin Heidegger has like talks. This is very much in that same line of thinking in Thoreau, where Heidegger very much, sorry, Heidegger came later. I think he was a German World War II philosopher who had to flee because he was actually Jewish. Gosh, I'm probably screwing that up. Maybe he was part of he endorsed the Nazis. But anyways, he's from that time period. But it carries along this vein where it's about your connection to nature. And we'll cover more in depth later. But whenever people are talking about like this, we need to reconnect to nature. We are from nature. We need to go back to nature. Technology is distorting humanity and keeping us away from our original roots. This is all along the same lines as Martin Heidegger, and like we will have to study him more in depth later because I can't remember all the broad strokes of it, but I'm guessing Zoroaster was also Zoroaster. I'm butchering these names because they're all ancient Greek and weird, and this 18th century literature is getting to me. But okay, well, interesting. 40 minutes. That's not too bad for today. Pick it up again tomorrow. Ciao.